Somewhere, buried in the corners of the internet and passed around in hushed conversations, there is a story. An explosion so violent, so instantaneous, so incomprehensibly powerful that it stripped 20,000 people of every piece of clothing on their bodies and killed them all before a single one of them could scream. No warning, no time to run. Just here one moment, gone the next, naked and dead in the open air. 20,000 people. Now, before you write that off as pure mythology, here's the uncomfortable part. Some version of this story keeps coming back. Different sources, different dates, different locations, but the same haunting core detail. The blast was so intense it tore the clothes clean off the victims, and the death toll was staggering. So what actually happened? Was this one catastrophic event that got buried and forgotten? Is it a legend that grew out of something real? Or is something stranger going on, where multiple disasters from different times and places got stitched together into a single terrifying story that spreads because it sounds almost too horrible to be invented? That's exactly what we're going to find out, and the answer is going to take us through blast physics, historical archives, wartime censorship, volcanic geology, and the strange psychology of how human beings remember catastrophe. Because here's the thing about a story this extreme, the details matter enormously. 20,000 dead is not a rounding error. Clothing stripped from bodies by sheer force is not a minor footnote. If those specific claims have any basis in reality, there should be evidence. Somewhere. Physical, documentary, or forensic. And if there isn't, we need to understand why. Here's where it gets complicated right away. When you start pulling on this thread, you don't find one event. You find several candidates scattered across different continents and centuries, each one sharing at least one element of the story. A munitions explosion here, an industrial chemical disaster there, a volcanic surge that nobody saw coming, a wartime catastrophe that governments had every reason to suppress. Any one of them, under the right conditions, could produce the kind of destruction this story describes, but none of them, at least not obviously, produces all of it at once. Which raises a question that forensic historians love, and that should keep you genuinely curious for the rest of this video. Are we looking at one event that got erased, or are we looking at the shadow of many events, collapsed into one viral myth? The honest answer right now is we don't know, and that's not a cop-out. That's actually the most interesting place to start, because the process of figuring it out, walking through what blast waves actually do to human tissue and fabric, examining what eyewitnesses historically report versus what the official record shows, understanding how archives disappear or get quietly reclassified, that process is going to tell us something real, not just about this story, but about how history gets lost in the first place. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to treat this like an investigation. We'll start with the physics, because before you can evaluate any claim about an explosion, you need to understand what explosions are actually capable of. Then we'll move through the candidates one by one, weighing the evidence, separating the documented from the speculated, and looking hard at the parts of the record that seem to be missing on purpose. By the end, we'll have a genuinely informed answer. Not a definitive one necessarily, but an honest one. And in my experience, honest answers are far more interesting than clean ones. One more thing before we go any further. I genuinely want to know where you're listening to this right now, and what time it is there. Drop it in the comments. It's one of my favourite things about making these, checking in and finding out it's midnight in Manila, or 6 in the morning in Manchester, or someone's on a lunch break in Sao Paulo. Wherever you are, you picked a good one tonight. Because this story, impossible as it sounds, turns out to have layers. Let's start with the physics. Because everything that follows, every candidate event, every disputed death toll, every strange detail about missing clothing, only makes sense once you understand what a large explosion actually does to the human body and the space around it. When something explodes, it doesn't just make a loud noise and throw debris. It releases energy so rapidly that the surrounding air essentially can't get out of the way fast enough. What you get instead is a wall of compressed air, a shock wave, moving outward from the source faster than the speed of sound. We're talking about pressures that can exceed several atmospheres in a fraction of a second. Your body, which has spent its entire existence at roughly 1 atmosphere of pressure, has no physiological response to that. There's no reflex fast enough. There's no bracing yourself. The shockwave arrives and interacts with your tissues before any part of your nervous system even registers that something has happened. Physicists and military engineers call this overpressure, and overpressure kills in a very specific way. It doesn't crush you from the outside in the way you might imagine. What it actually does is violently compress and then decompress air-filled spaces inside your body. Your lungs are essentially balloons. When a shockwave hits them, those balloons get slammed, rupture, hemorrhage. Primary blast lung injury, as it's technically called, is one of the leading causes of death in close-range explosion events, and it leaves no external mark. A person killed this way can look completely intact from the outside. No burns, no visible wounds, no obvious trauma, just dead. The same thing happens in the inner ear, in sinuses, in the gut. Air-filled cavities throughout the body absorb that pressure wave and pay for it catastrophically. Then comes the wind blast. This is the secondary effect that follows the pressure wave, and it's less appreciated but equally brutal. After the overpressure peak passes, air rushes outward from the explosion at hurricane speeds, sometimes far exceeding 200 miles per hour in a large detonation. This is the force that picks up objects and throws them. It's also the force that tears clothing. And this is where the specific claim at the heart of our story starts to intersect with documented physics. Here's the distinction that matters for everything we're going to examine later. There's a difference between being blown naked and being stripped. Genuinely being blown naked, meaning the wind blast is so powerful that fabric is physically wrenched from a living or recently killed body. That happens. It's documented in major explosion events throughout the 20th century. Clothing, especially lightweight clothing, offers almost no mechanical resistance compared to the kinetic energy of a large blast wind. Buttons fail, seams split. Synthetic fabrics that behave differently from woven cotton can essentially vaporize at high temperatures. Shoes, being denser and more mechanically attached, often survive when everything above them is gone. This detail, shoes remaining on victims while the rest of their clothing is absent, has appeared in multiple documented disaster accounts, and it's one of those forensic fingerprints worth remembering. The alternative is clothing being shredded rather than removed cleanly. In fragmentation events, where the explosion generates high-velocity debris, clothing gets lacerated along with the tissue underneath. What's left might look stripped but is actually destroyed, embedded in wounds or scattered. The visual result to a first responder or eyewitness can look similar, but the mechanism is entirely different. One tells you something about blast wind velocity. The other tells you something about the nature of the explosion itself. Keeping that distinction in mind matters when we start evaluating specific accounts. So what actually kills people in a major explosion? Work through the causes in order of distance from the source, and you get a remarkably grim hierarchy. At the epicenter, where the overpressure is highest, tissue damage is total. Organs rupture, eardrums are obliterated. Brain trauma occurs not from impact, but from the pressure wave traveling through fluid-filled tissue, which doesn't compress the same way air does. Traumatic brain injury from blast, what military medicine has spent enormous effort studying since the Iraq War, doesn't require your head to hit anything. The wave itself does the work. Further out, fragmentation becomes the dominant killer. Any explosion that involves a container, whether that's a shell casing, a boiler, a storage tank, a ship's hull, generates shrapnel travelling at speeds that make bullets look slow. A single fragment the size of a fingernail moving at the right velocity is lethal. Multiply that by thousands of fragments across a large casualty area, and you begin to understand how single events can generate mass fatalities very quickly. The human body is not particularly resistant to fast-moving metal. Then there's the heat. Depending on what's burning, the thermal pulse from a large explosion can last fractions of a second or several minutes. The initial fireball can reach temperatures that simply obliterate organic material at close range. Further away, flash burns occur, the kind that are superficial but cover enormous body surface areas. Flash burns to expose skin, the face, hands, the back of the neck, are a consistent feature of large explosion survivor accounts across history. They're also a clue. The pattern of burns on a victim's body can tell investigators which direction the person was facing relative to the blast source, and whether they had any warning at all. Firestorms are a separate category of horror entirely. In the right conditions, where there's enough fuel, whether that's buildings, vegetation, spilled industrial chemicals or stored ordnance, an initial explosion can ignite secondary fires that merge, creating their own wind patterns as hot air rises and cooler air rushes in to replace it. Cities have burned this way, port facilities have burned this way. The firestorm doesn't just kill people directly. It consumes evidence. It destroys the physical record of what happened, which becomes critically important when we start talking about why some disasters are harder to verify than others. Flying debris, which investigators technically call tertiary blast effects, rounds out the picture. Windows become projectiles. Walls become projectiles. Vehicles, shipping containers, structural elements, anything not anchored past its breaking point enters the debris field. Survivors of large urban explosions frequently describe a surreal moment between the initial wave and the debris arrival, a brief fraction of a second where everything seems to stop before the world falls apart. That interval, measured in milliseconds, is the difference between what physics predicts and what human memory records. It's part of why eyewitness accounts of the same event can vary so wildly. And this brings us to the casualty counting problem. Because once you understand the physics, you immediately understand why the numbers are so hard to verify. A large explosion in a populated area kills people in multiple ways simultaneously. Some die instantly with no external marks. Some die from burns hours or days later. Some die from injuries that get misattributed to the chaos that follows: fires, building collapses, crowd crushes during evacuation. In a major disaster, especially one occurring during wartime or involving government infrastructure, the people responsible for counting the dead are often the same people with the most interest in controlling the number that gets reported. That's not conspiracy theory. It's an institutional reality with extensive historical documentation. Compound that with physical destruction of records, and you get a situation where even well-meaning attempts to reconstruct a death toll years later can produce wildly different estimates. Historians examining the same event sometimes disagree by factors of 10 or more, not because one of them is incompetent, but because the data simply doesn't exist in a form that allows precision. The 20,000 figure in our story is either a precise count, which would require remarkable record-keeping under catastrophic conditions, or an estimate, which means someone made assumptions. Understanding which one it is and how those assumptions were made is part of what we're going to be doing as we work through the candidates. There's one more thing worth establishing here, because it shapes everything that follows. Explosions are not uniform. Two explosions producing the same total energy release can have completely different effects on human bodies, depending on the duration of the pressure wave, the nature of the surrounding environment, whether the blast is contained or open air, and whether secondary fires develop. A blast in an enclosed space, a tunnel, a ship's hold, a warehouse, kills differently than an open-air detonation of the same magnitude. This means that when someone describes an explosion powerful enough to strip 20,000 people of their clothing, we're not just looking at a size threshold. We're looking at a very specific combination of conditions, a particular geography, a particular explosive material, a particular density of population in a particular kind of space. That specificity is our best investigative tool, because if the event really happened, those conditions had to exist somewhere, in some archive, in some geological record, in some buried registry of the dead. There should be a trace of them. Finding that trace is exactly what we're going to try to do. So now we've established what explosions do: the overpressure, the wind blast, the fragmentation, the heat, all of it working simultaneously across a gradient of distance from the source. And within all of that physics, there's one detail that keeps appearing in the accounts attached to this story. One detail that witnesses remember with unusual clarity and consistency: the clothing, specifically the absence of it. This is worth dwelling on because at first glance it sounds like embellishment. Mass nakedness sounds like the kind of detail that gets added to a story to make it more dramatic, more horrifying, more shareable. But when you look at the documented mechanics of large explosion events, missing clothing is not embellishment. It's actually one of the more diagnostically useful features a forensic investigator or historian can find. It tells you something specific, and that specificity is exactly what we need. Let's work through the mechanisms because there are several, and they're not all the same thing. The most straightforward is blast wind stripping. We touched on this in the previous section, but it's worth going deeper. When a large explosion generates a wind blast moving at 200 or more miles per hour, fabric under tension fails at its weakest points first. Seams, button attachments, collar edges, the places where the garment changes direction or has any structural irregularity. What this means in practice is that a shirt doesn't get peeled off cleanly in one piece. It gets torn, shredded along stress lines, and the fragments fly outward with the wind. A survivor in the moderate blast zone, close enough to experience the full force of the wind but far enough to survive the overpressure, might emerge with their clothing essentially gone, replaced by strips of fabric still caught under a belt or around an ankle, and their shoes, as noted before, may still be on. Dense, mechanically attached, laced down, the wind gets the shirt, it doesn't always get the boots, but wind tearing is only one mechanism, thermal stripping is another, and it's more insidious precisely because it doesn't always leave obvious burn marks. The thermal pulse from a large explosion, especially one involving industrial chemicals or stored fuel, can be brief enough that it doesn't ignite skin but long enough and hot enough to ignite synthetic fabric. Cotton scorches, polyester melts. Lighter fabrics simply cease to exist. A survivor can emerge from the thermal radius of a large detonation with their skin intact, or nearly so, while every synthetic layer they were wearing has been either vaporized or reduced to ash that falls away when they move. They're not burned in any way that requires immediate medical attention, they're just unclothed, and they may not even fully register what's happened to them, because the shock response suppresses that kind of awareness entirely. Which brings us to the third mechanism, and this one is underappreciated: water immersion, flooding, and the secondary hydraulic chaos that large explosions can generate in certain environments. A harbour explosion, a waterfront blast, a detonation near a dam or reservoir. Any of these can generate waves and flooding that follows the initial blast wind. Clothing that has been partially torn or weakened by the initial explosion becomes saturated, heavy, and mechanically compromised. Survivors pulled from water, or who pulled themselves from it, often lose remaining clothing in the process. The seam that was holding together a garment already stressed by blast wind finally gives way when waterlogged fabric doubles in weight and a person crawls over debris. The result, to a first responder arriving at the scene 30 minutes after the event, looks exactly like what you'd see from blast stripping alone. The intermediate steps are invisible, and this is where the psychology becomes as important as the physics. Eyewitnesses to catastrophic events don't remember everything equally. The human brain under extreme stress compresses some details and amplifies others in ways that psychologists have documented extensively in survivor testimony research. What gets amplified tends to be anomalous, things that violate expectation, things that the brain flags as deeply wrong in ways it can't immediately process. A crowd of people without clothes is exactly that kind of image. It violates something fundamental about how we categorize other humans, the social encoding that clothing represents. Witnesses who can barely recall what time of day the event occurred, who struggle to estimate how many people were involved, who disagree with other witnesses about which direction the blast came from, those same witnesses will often describe the clothing detail with striking consistency and clarity. Not because they're inventing it, because that particular image lodged somewhere that ordinary memories don't reach. This means that when multiple independent witnesses across different accounts describe survivors or victims being unclothed, we should weight that observation more heavily than we might initially. It's the kind of detail that's hard to falsely converge on. People independently inventing or embellishing a story tend to add dramatic details that sound plausible to them. Mass nakedness is not an obvious embellishment. It's the kind of detail you include because you saw it. Now, here's where this clue becomes genuinely useful for narrowing our investigation. Not all explosion types produce this effect at scale. A fragmentation-dominant event, where shrapnel is the primary killer, tends to shred clothing along with tissue. What's left on victims looks lacerated, embedded, destroyed in place, not stripped. A low-order deflagration, which is a slow burn rather than a true detonation, rarely generates the wind velocities needed for mechanical stripping. A contained explosion, one inside a building where the blast energy is absorbed by structure before it can develop full wind velocity in open air, produces different patterns than an open-air detonation near a large exposed population. The combination we're looking for, the one that produces mass clothing loss across a large number of people, is a high-order open-air detonation or a very rapid overpressure event in a semi-enclosed space that vents quickly, combined with a thermal pulse significant enough to destroy lighter fabrics, potentially followed by secondary flooding or water involvement. That's a specific signature. It points towards specific categories of events, specific types of locations, specific industrial or military contexts, which means the clothing isn't just a disturbing detail, it's a filter, and as we start working through the candidates, we're going to keep running each one through it. So we have a physical filter now, a specific kind of blast, a specific kind of environment. But that still leaves us staring at the other big piece of the story that doesn't quite make sense on first pass. The number. 20,000 people, stripped naked and killed. That's the line that gets repeated. Passed along in books, in articles, on forums, in did you know listicles. It has the right shape to stick in your head. It's big enough to be shocking, round enough to be memorable, and just specific enough to sound like it came from somewhere official. But when you hear a number like that attached to an event that's supposedly been erased, you have to stop and ask, what does that actually mean? What was someone counting? Because 20,000 can hide a lot. First, casualty numbers aren't one number, there are at least 4. Deaths, injuries, missing, displaced. Those categories blur, especially in large disasters, but they're not interchangeable. If a refinery explodes next to a dense neighborhood, you can easily have a few thousand dead in the immediate blast and fire, tens of thousands injured, many of them minor by medical definition but life-changing in reality. Thousands more who simply vanish from any registry because their bodies were never recovered or were buried without identification or their paperwork burned. And then a much larger ring of people who weren't physically harmed at all but lost homes, jobs, or entire neighborhoods. They become refugees of a single afternoon. Any one of those rings can end up being the 20,000 in a story. 20,000 dead, or 20,000 injured, or 20,000 affected. The number is the same, but the reality behind it is wildly different. This is part of why early numbers after a catastrophe are almost always wrong and not in a consistent direction. In the first hours, officials on the ground are counting what they can see. Bodies in streets, people in triage areas, names on whatever list survived. That tends to undercount. People are still buried in rubble. Some will die of injuries days later. Children are in different shelters than their parents. Entire households are simply somewhere else. But there's another kind of early number that goes the other way. The panic estimate. A police chief shouts a guess into a reporter's microphone. A doctor in an overwhelmed hospital says, "We're seeing thousands." And that quote gets attached to deaths instead of patients today. Someone mishears 200 as 2,000. That first inflated guess goes out on a wire service and suddenly every paper in 3 languages repeats it. Governments learn from this, but not in a way that makes your job as a historian any easier. In regimes obsessed with stability, the instinct is to minimize. The first official communiques after a blast will pick the smallest defensible number and stick to it as long as possible. A few dozen casualties, limited damage, situation under control. Sometimes that's outright lying. Sometimes it's officials clinging to what they can safely say while knowing full well the reality is still unfolding. On the other side, newspapers and later retellings have their own incentives. A bigger number gets more attention. The deadlock between an obviously huge event and a suspiciously small official figure invites speculation. Journalists start quoting unofficial sources who double or triple the tally. A decade later, a historian writing for a popular audience finds the highest published number in the pile and, maybe without thinking about it too hard, uses that. Another decade and someone else rounds it to the nearest dramatic 1,000. The number creeps. Then there's the darker reason numbers drift. Evidence disappears. Mass graves are efficient, especially when you're dealing with decomposing bodies in heat, limited refrigeration, and a government desperate to restore normalcy. You dig a trench, you bury what you can't identify, you mark it poorly, or not at all. The same logic applies to emergency cremation. Burn the remains, scatter or store the ash. Tell families that all victims have been respectfully handled, without ever admitting that no one can really say how many individuals were in the piles. Registries that could have answered that question go missing. Civil records burn in the same fire that killed the people they listed. Hospital ledgers get pulped in later renovations. Military archives are deliberately weeded decades later by some board officer told to remove irrelevant material. In authoritarian states, this is sometimes policy. In chaotic democracies, it can be incompetence, negligence, or simple entropy. Either way, the denominator disappears. You can't say how many are dead because you no longer know how many there were to begin with. All of this means that when you confront a claim like 20,000 people were killed and stripped naked, you need more than a gut reaction. You need a method. Start with sources. Who said 20,000 first? Was it a local official, a foreign diplomat, a newspaper, a survivor, a later historian? Are they speaking from data, from rumour, or from second-hand hearsay? A casualty figure traced back to an internal insurance report or a Red Cross cable is not the same as one that appears out of nowhere in a memoir 40 years later. Then look at proximity. How close in time and space was the source to the blast? An engineer who helped clear rubble for 6 months is a different kind of witness than a journalist who flew in for 2 days, which is different again from a writer reconstructing events from a different continent a century later. Closer is not always more honest, but it's usually better informed about the scale of what actually happened. Finally, check consistency. Do independent lines of evidence converge? Civil records, cemetery maps, church registers, hospital archives, insurance payouts, school enrollment drops, missing persons notices, refugee camp lists. You're rarely going to get a perfect match, but you're looking for orders of magnitude. If every semi-independent source points to a few hundred dead and one stray account says 20,000, you should be suspicious. If, on the other hand, official figures say 287 dead, while refugee counts, hospital logs, and foreign diplomatic cables all hint at thousands of unacknowledged bodies, you should be suspicious in the other direction. When we apply that kind of scrutiny to this story, the 20,000 stops being a fact and becomes what it really is, a claim we can test, stress, and either roughly bracket or quietly set aside. And now that we've built those tools, blast signatures from the missing clothes, and numerical skepticism from the missing records, we can finally start walking through the actual candidates. What kind of real-world event could leave that many people unclothed, that many bodies uncounted, and that big a hole in the historical record? The most obvious suspect is the kind of disaster we actually know a lot about. When vast amounts of explosives are piled up in one place and something somewhere goes wrong. If you're going to get a blast so violent it rips clothes off tens of thousands of people, you don't start with a single bomb. You start with a city that has quietly turned itself into a bomb. Port cities in wartime are perfect for this. They collect danger, not just one kind of danger, but layers of it. You have cargo ships arriving full of shells, TNT, propellant, depth charges, aviation fuel. Other ships are leaving with the same. On the dockside there are warehouses of spare ammunition, temporary depots set up just for the duration, barracks, workshops, rail yards stacked with boxcars full of yet more munitions. Every one of those is supposed to be separated, controlled, monitored. In practice, especially in a total war, they're not. Schedules slip. Convoys back up. A ship that was supposed to be in port for 12 hours sits there for a week because paperwork got mixed up or a harbour pilot got sick. Warehouses that were rated for one type of explosive get quietly repurposed for something more volatile. Safety distances between stacks are shaved because someone needs the space. Guards are undertrained, overworked, or asleep. Then something tiny happens, a dropped shell, a mishandled winch, an electrical fault, oily rags in a corner overheating, a single cigarette in the wrong place. At first it's just a local fire, the kind dockworkers see all the time and think they can handle with hoses and a little bravado. But explosives don't burn politely. Ammunition is designed to go from stable to catastrophic in a fraction of a second. When a fire reaches a critical part of a load, detonators, booster charges, a magazine under pressure, the change is sudden. You get what investigators call a sympathetic detonation. One pile sets off the next, and then the next, each explosion compressing and heating the nearby explosives until they cross their own thresholds. On a ship, that chain reaction can move faster than people can run. The hull focuses the blast. The confined spaces channel pressure. One hold goes, then another, then the magazine under the forward gun, then the aft. The ship doesn't just explode. It ceases to be a ship and becomes a rapidly expanding cloud of hot gas, steel fragments, and burning fuel. In a port, that cloud doesn't play nice. The first pressure wave slams into nearby warehouses and buildings, turning windows into knives and walls into shrapnel. It also kicks up a blast wind, air rushing outward behind the shock front at hurricane or tornado speeds. That wind is what strips people. It doesn't have to be hot enough to burn their clothes off. It just has to move fast enough with enough debris mixed in to tear fabric, snap belts, rip buttons, and yank anything loose clean away. Survivors of known explosions like Halifax in 1917 and Texas City in 1947 describe exactly this. People found on streets and in fields in various stages of undress, clothes shredded, shoes gone, Bodies flayed by glass and splinters, not heat. Others hurled dozens or hundreds of meters, stripped as they flew. Now add the secondary effects. The same blast that strips people knocks over stoves, ruptures gas lines, tosses oil lamps into curtains, shatters chemical tanks. Fires bloom, first as isolated building blazes, then as a joined-up wall of flame. Burning debris rains down over a wide radius. In wooden districts, or areas with packed tenements and narrow streets, you get firestorms. People who survive the blast find themselves in a city that is very literally on fire in every direction. At this point, counting anything becomes almost impossible. Hospitals along the waterfront are themselves shattered. Doctors and nurses are dead or missing. The surviving staff are dragging the nearest wounded into basements, schoolhouses, churches, any building that's still standing and not burning. Triage happens in courtyards, on sidewalks, on the steps of government offices. Records, if they're kept at all, are improvised. Names scribbled on scraps of paper, chalk marks on arms, lists shouted and half heard. Behind all of this there is paperwork, or there should be. For a munition ship or depot there are usually shipping manifests, what the vessel was carrying, where it came from, where it was supposed to go. There are port authority logs, arrival and departure times, berth assignments, notes about dangerous cargo. Military supply records, which units were waiting on those shells, which depot signed for them, which quartermaster signed off. There are accident reports, court-martial files, inquests. Hospitals, even in chaos, tend to generate ledgers, admissions, diagnoses, deaths, transfers. City authorities issue death certificates, authorize burials, requisition bulldozers for mass graves. Insurance companies open claims. Foreign consulates file cables home about citizens killed or missing. If you're hunting for a lost catastrophe, this is where you'd expect to find its fossil, a thicket of dull, bureaucratic paper behind the drama. A blast that maims thousands and flattens half a port doesn't just leave craters, it leaves forms. But this is also where wartime secrecy walks on stage. In peace, a disaster is embarrassing. In war, it can be existential. A single munition ship going up might represent months of production. It might reveal to the enemy that you're stockpiling in a particular harbour, or that you're about to launch a major offensive in a specific theatre. It might expose negligence by senior officers whose careers, and sometimes lives, depend on maintaining the illusion of competence, so the file names change. What might originally be titled Catastrophic Explosion of Ammunition Ship in X Harbour becomes Incident at Dock 14, or Harbour Fire. Key documents are stamped with higher classification levels. Censorship offices comb through telegrams and newspaper copy, blacking out casualty figures, forbidding mention of specific ship names, banning photographs that show recognizable landmarks. Official communiques emphasize bravery, efficiency, rapid response. They talk about limited losses, regrettable accidents, sabotage under investigation. Numbers are rounded down. Foreign journalists are kept away from the worst-hit areas for their own safety. Military courts of inquiry meet behind closed doors. Their proceedings are filed away under generic headings and sometimes, years later, quietly destroyed. Meanwhile, the public story fragments. Locals know something enormous happened. They saw windows blown out 10 kilometers inland. They buried relatives whose bodies arrived without clothes. They tell each other their own numbers, their own explanations, their own rumours of ships that vanished, and warehouses that must have been packed with something big. Outside the city, the rest of the country might hear only that there was an explosion in the port. Abroad, the story shrinks further, if it's reported at all. Maybe one line in a neutral embassy cable. Large blast reported in X. Casualties unknown, believed to involve ammunition. Decades later, when archives are selectively opened or selectively missing, you're left with a strange mix. A few scattered official documents, often sanitized. Survivor testimonies that insist the sky turned white and people were blown naked in their thousands. A handful of foreign reports hinting at much larger casualties than domestic papers ever admitted. This is exactly the kind of environment where a phrase like 20,000 stripped naked and killed can take root, anchored loosely in a real munitions catastrophe, inflated or minimized depending on who is talking, and warped by secrecy into something that looks less like history and more like myth. But before we settle on that explanation, we have to be honest about something else. Explosives aren't the only way to get a blast that tears clothes off and kills on a mass scale. There's another class of modern disaster that can mimic a small nuclear detonation without ever involving a single shell. If you wanted to build a bomb without calling it a bomb, you wouldn't stack artillery shells, you'd stack chemistry. The modern world runs on huge quantities of substances that are, at heart, stored energy and captive reaction. Fertilizer, refinery gases, petrochemicals, solvent tanks, pipelines. None of them are supposed to explode. They are supposed to burn in controlled ways, inside engines and boilers and industrial processes. But the physics don't care about job descriptions. Take ammonium nitrate, the same fertilizer that shattered Texas City and Beirut. On paper, it's just a solid oxidizer. Under the right conditions, confined, contaminated with fuel, heated unevenly, it becomes something that behaves a lot like a high explosive. You don't even need a detonator in the classic sense. A warehouse fire that starts in a corner, a smouldering hotspot under a pile, a small confined explosion in a neighbouring building. Once a critical mass of ammonium nitrate crosses certain temperature and pressure thresholds, the reaction can run away. The solid decomposes violently into hot gases. Those gases expand faster than the material can vent. Pressure spikes. The entire mass transitions from burning to detonating. Now scale that up to thousands of tons. The blast wave from a fertilizer detonation is brutally simple. It moves outwards as a sharp, overpressured front capable of crushing lungs, rupturing eardrums, pancaking buildings. Behind it, as with munitions, comes the blast wind, a racing wall of air that can hit with hurricane or tornado force. That combination is more than enough to strip people. At the very centre, there's another effect. Flash. A massive, near-instant release of energy raises temperatures in the detonation zone and along reflective surfaces to levels that can ignite or vaporize thin materials. Clothes, curtains, paper, hair. These don't smoulder. They vanish. Skin exposed for even milliseconds to that kind of thermal pulse can suffer deep burns, while fabrics either catch fire or are shredded away by the pressure jump and wind. Refinery catastrophes work on a similar principle but often add a step. Instead of a solid oxidizer, you have tanks of liquefied gas, propane, butane, ethylene, LPG, stored under pressure. A leak, a rupture, a safety valve stuck open, and you get a dense, invisible cloud of flammable vapor hugging the ground, flowing along ditches and alleys. If it finds an ignition source, an electrical spark, a running engine, you don't just get a fire, you get a vapor cloud explosion. The entire mixed air-fuel volume burns almost at once. That rapid combustion generates huge pressures, which again form a blast wave and wind powerful enough to tear roofs off houses and clothes off bodies. If the cloud is large enough, the thermal radiation can be intense enough to cause third-degree burns in a fraction of a second over hundreds of meters. And unlike a pure high-explosive blast, this kind of event keeps going. Tanks in the refinery or chemical plant heat up, their contents expand, and one by one they fail in what engineers politely call blave, boiling liquid expanding vapor explosions. Every bleve is its own bomb, hurling metal fragments and fireballs across an already devastated district. In that chaos, your clothing doesn't stand much of a chance. The fabrics people actually wear in industrial towns, cheap synthetics, thin cotton, oil-stained work gear, respond badly to heat. Synthetic fibers soften and melt into the skin. Cotton and wool flash ignite, then are torn away by the shock front or burned to ash in seconds. Belts snap, buttons shear off, shoes are blown from feet by the pressure wave or ripped off as people are thrown and tumble across rubble. Witnesses from chemical disasters consistently talk about naked bodies, not because flames politely burned clothes off and left skin untouched, but because the combination of blast, heat and abrasion leaves people partially or completely undressed in an instant. A person caught just inside a window can have the clothes ripped from the blast-facing side of their body, while the other side is shielded by a wall. Someone outdoors might be flayed by glass and gravel, their garments torn into rags, shoes gone, pockets turned inside out. Then there's the invisible killer that chemicals specialize in: toxicity. Munitions explosions mostly kill in the moment: shock, shrapnel, collapsing structures. Industrial chemicals can poison slowly. A fertilizer or pesticide plant may release clouds of nitric oxides, chlorine, phosgene, or other breakdown products that don't announce themselves with flames. Refinery fires can load the air with carbon monoxide, cyanides, heavy hydrocarbons. People who survive the initial blast, who manage to walk away under their own power, they already have lungs that are being chemically burned from the inside. They die hours or days later of pulmonary edema, lungs filling with fluid, cardiac stress, organ failure. Others survive the acute phase but are left with long-term damage that kills them years ahead of schedule. These delayed deaths don't always show up in the first casualty counts. They're scattered across home deaths, small clinics, remote villages, and are easy for officials to ignore or minimise. Now picture where these plants usually sit. Not in open fields with plenty of safety distance. They live inside or right next to working-class neighbourhoods. Night shift crews inside the facility. Families in cramped housing just beyond the fence line. Informal settlements pressed up against tank farms and warehouses because land is cheap and jobs are close. When the sirens finally sound, if they do, it's already too late for most of those people. Night shift workers are at their posts, often in light work clothes, sometimes stripped down because of the heat. Families are asleep in thin-walled houses, windows open, doors unlatched. Children are in the top bunks. Grandparents are in ground floor rooms whose windows face the plant. A blast that might only kill a few dozen in a well-buffered facility can kill hundreds or thousands in a dense ring of housing, especially at night when everyone is home, not scattered across the city at work and school. And because it's night, because so many of the victims are in bed, the clothing factor is amplified. People are in underwear, nightshirts, thin pyjamas, or nothing at all. A blast wind that might strip a jacket and hat in daytime now strips everything. Bodies are found in streets and courtyards without clothes not only because of physics, but because there were fewer clothes to begin with. From a historian's point of view, these disasters leave a different kind of footprint than munitions. There might not be military court-martials, but there are plant safety logs, engineering drawings, maintenance records. Companies keep inventories of stored chemicals, shipment receipts, tank capacity charts. When everything goes wrong, governments convene commissions of inquiry. There are technical reports on cause, valve failure, improper storage, ignored warning alarms. There are worker testimonies about leaky pipes and missing safety drills. Civil courts get involved. Families sue. Trade unions demand answers. Insurance companies, who absolutely do not like paying out for entire neighbourhoods, hire their own experts to argue about negligence, foreseeability, and acts of God. Those arguments generate mountains of paperwork, claims files, legal briefs, depositions, settlement agreements. If you're looking for a forgotten industrial chemical catastrophe that could match our mystery, tens of thousands affected, people found stripped, mass casualties in a working-class district, this is where you'd expect to find traces, not just in the sensational headlines of the week after, but in the dry language of liability and compensation, in the plant's accident books, in government environmental agency archives, in court dockets and insurance loss summaries. And yet, even here, the numbers can blur. Companies have powerful incentives to push casualty estimates down. Governments worried about investment and image may quietly help. Toxic deaths that come days later in hospital wards can be coded under generic respiratory failure rather than disaster-related. Migrant workers and informal residents might not be counted at all if they weren't officially supposed to be there. The result is a pattern we've seen more than once. Locals insist thousands died. Official tallies say a few hundred. International reports split the difference and hedge with at least. The truth is buried somewhere in the overlap between blast physics, toxicology, and paperwork. So if our vanished explosion was chemical rather than military, fertilizer, gas, refinery, or some lethal combination, the clues we need are going to look less like war diaries and more like balance sheets and lawsuit archives. But chemicals still don't have a monopoly on city-killing blasts. Nature has her own arsenal, and some of her weapons behave uncannily like giant industrial accidents. When people imagine volcano deaths, they usually picture slow suffocation under a gentle rain of ash, streets buried knee-deep, roofs sagging, then caving in, people choking, blinded, stumbling through grey dust until their lungs give out. Those disasters do happen. They're called ashfall events. They can kill tens of thousands by collapsing buildings, contaminating water, and ruining crops over whole regions. But ashfall is the quiet cousin. The thing that blows clothes off people's bodies and leaves them frozen mid-step isn't a tranquil shower of ash. It's what happens when a volcano stops oozing and starts acting like a bomb. Pyroclastic flows and surges. A pyroclastic flow is what you get when a column of volcanic ash, gas and shattered rock can no longer support itself in the sky and collapses. Instead of going up, it comes down and races outward along the ground. A roiling avalanche of particles and gas that can move at highway speeds, sometimes faster than a jetliner at takeoff. Temperatures inside can easily exceed 400, 500, 600 degrees Celsius. Some historical flows have been reconstructed at over 800. A pyroclastic surge is the leaner, more mobile version, less dense, more turbulent, better at riding up and over ridges, skimming across water, snaking into valleys you thought were safe. It's the part of the current that can jump city walls and sweep through streets. To a human body, both are lethal combinations of three things: heat, velocity, and abrasion. The heat is intense but brief. If you're close to the source, it can be instantly fatal. Thermal shock that stops your heart or causes catastrophic burns even before you inhale. Farther out, you might be unconscious in seconds, dead in minutes. Skin exposed to hundreds of degrees doesn't slowly cook. It blisters, splits, carbonizes. Hair ignites. Synthetics melt and fuse into the flesh beneath. Most everyday fabrics cannot survive that environment. Cotton and linen flash ignite, burn away in seconds, then are blasted into fibrous ash by the turbulent flow. Wool chars and disintegrates. Nylon and polyester don't burn off so much as soften, shrink, tear, and smear. Buttons, zippers, snaps, and seams fail as the cloth is yanked and twisted in a roaring, sand-laden wind. Because that's the second ingredient: speed. A pyroclastic current doesn't just engulf you, it hammers you. The gas inside may not be supersonic, but the particle-rich front can hit with the force of a hurricane inside a sandblaster. Pressures shift violently as eddies spin around buildings and collide. People can be knocked down, rolled, slammed against walls. Limbs are wrenched, belts snap. Footwear is torn away. Clothes that were already weakened by heat or catching fire are shredded into ribbons, ripped from the body and carried away. Then there's the abrasion. Volcanic ash is not like fireplace ash. It's pulverized rock. Microscopic shards of glass and crystal. Mixed into the flow with larger lapillian stones, it becomes a grinding, cutting medium. As the current roars past, it scours paint from cars, bark from trees, plaster from walls. On human skin, it strips away the outer layers, embeds itself in wounds, rips fabric fibers apart. A shirt that was never fully burned can still end up in tatters, most of it torn free in that abrasive onslaught. The result, when the flow finally settles and cools, is a grimly familiar tableau in volcanic archaeology. Bodies lying where they fell, sometimes in lifelike positions, often partially or completely naked. Limbs curled against heat, hands over faces, clothing reduced to a few fused scraps at the waist or shoulders, or gone entirely, leaving only belt buckles, metal fasteners and jewellery to hint at what people had been wearing. This is one way to strip 20,000 people without a single bullet. And the difference between a simple ashfall disaster and a blast-style eruption matters for our mystery. Ashfall can be deadly, but it tends to leave more of the pre-existing world recognizable. Roof lines, road grids, the ghostly outlines of neighborhoods under drifts of dust. People die in beds, under collapsed beams, still mostly dressed. Rescue workers dig through debris that looks like a ruined city. A blast with pyroclastic currents doesn't just bury, it remodels. The overpressure of the eruptive blast can flatten forests, tip over masonry, rip off roofs. Then the pyroclastic current pours in, filling basements, cellars, rooms. It can carve new channels through town, obliterate landmarks, bury one district deeper than another depending on the flow path. Entire streets can disappear under meters of welded tuff, ash so hot it fuses into rock. Where ashfall leaves a layer, pyroclastic activity can create a whole new ground level. Houses, shops, archives, church records, municipal offices, they're not just damaged, they're entombed under a geologic deposit that, to later generations, looks like natural rock. If no one comes back to dig, if rebuilding happens on the margins instead of on top, the old town effectively vanishes from administrative memory. Personal documentation fares even worse. Paper burns, ink carbonizes, photographs curl and crumble, wooden cabinets holding land deeds and census books ignite and are then smashed flat by the flow. Metal boxes can survive, but only if they don't overheat. Most don't. The same current that strips your clothes also turns your bureaucratic footprint into ash. So how many people were there? That's where volcanic disasters start to resemble our mystery problem. Casualty estimates from major eruptions are often wildly variable. Even when they happen in the age of telegraphs and newspapers, villages near volcanoes can be seasonal, with populations swelling during planting or harvest. Some residents may be unregistered migrants, recent arrivals, or refugees. People flee as the eruption begins. Some make it, some don't. Others arrive later as rescuers and die in secondary surges. In the chaos, bodies are lost, miscounted, double-counted, or never found at all. Governments under colonial administrations, or in politically fragile states, may have incentives to minimize the numbers. Local communities, in shock and grief, may overestimate based on how everyone they knew is gone. Newspapers print early figures that harden into legend. Scientific reports decades later try to reconstruct populations from tax rolls and patchy church registers, but those were never perfect to begin with. Ask how many died in some famous eruptions and you'll still get ranges. 10,000 to 30,000. 15,000 officially, but locals insisting it was far higher. Even with photographs, cables, and international observers, the final body count can remain contested for generations. Now take that same kind of event and drop it into a place and time where record-keeping was fragile, where the eruption also destroyed the centers of administration, and where survivors scattered instead of rebuilding on the ruins. You end up with exactly the kind of story we're chasing. A blast that could strip bodies bare, kill on a massive scale, and then disappear behind a veil of rock and uncertainty. But pyroclastic horror isn't the only natural force that can erase a city and its paperwork. There's another, slower catastrophe that often follows, the ground itself shaking, gas lines rupturing, fires blooming from 1,000 broken pipes. When the ground moves, it doesn't just topple buildings, it rearranges what a city is made of. Think about a modern, dense town, even from the late 19th or early 20th century. Brick, stone, wood, coal stoves, kerosene lamps, open flames in bakeries and factories, and, as you move into the industrial era, a new ingredient threaded through the streets: gas, illuminating gas for streetlights, gas mains for home cooking and heating, later high-pressure natural gas for industry, all of it running under sidewalks and cobblestones in pipes that were never designed to flex. An earthquake doesn't politely crack one building at a time, it heaves whole districts. Streets buckle, foundations shift a few centimeters, then a few more, then fail. Masonry walls shear, brick chimneys twist and snap, those buried gas lines, they tear like paper. Every broken joint is now a blowtorch. Gas under pressure hisses into basements, crawl spaces, and shattered rooms. It seeps through rubble, follows sewer lines, collects under fallen roofs. It only takes one candle relit after the shaking, one lantern knocked over, one spark from a collapsing electrical line. Then you don't just have a fire, you have a network of simultaneous ignitions, each fed by an invisible fuel that doesn't care about fire breaks or narrow alleys. To people on the ground, this doesn't feel like a bunch of small blazes. It feels like being inside a chain of explosions. Windows burst outward as gas pockets ignite. Whole storefronts vanish in a single whoomph. Brick facades peel off and fall as the interior air flashes from cold to superheated in milliseconds. Roofs lift and drop. Firefighters trying to approach one flame front are suddenly caught as a new one erupts behind them from some hidden leak. The language people reach for in the aftermath is almost always the same. It was like a bomb. The city blew up. Explosions everywhere. And when enough structures go up at once, you get something even stranger. A firestorm. Firestorms are what happens when a blaze grows so large and intense that it starts driving its own weather. The heat rising over a burning district pulls in cooler air at ground level. That incoming air feeds the flames, which grow hotter, which pull harder, which suck more oxygen in. Soon you have hurricane-force winds racing into the inferno, and a column of superheated air punching into the sky. To a survivor, this can feel like an explosion stretched out in time. The roar is continuous, punctuated by abrupt detonations as gas pockets or oil stores ignite. The wind rips at clothes and skin, flings debris down streets. Temperatures near the core can soar to several hundred degrees, high enough to kill exposed people in seconds. Here's where the clothing mystery creeps back in. In a massive urban fire, people don't all die in one instant. Some are crushed in collapses, some suffocate in smoke-filled stairwells, others are overtaken by advancing flame fronts or radiant heat. But if you happen to collapse or be trapped in the wrong microenvironment, a courtyard turned into an oven, a street where the firestorm's intake wind channels the heat past you, you can experience a very fast, very intense thermal blast. Not as uniform as a pyroclastic surge, but similar in effect on fabric. Clothes ignite, then are blown or torn off by the violent draft. Synthetics melt and shrink. Buttons pop as threads burn. People running from the flames strip off burning garments in panic, toss them aside, keep going, collapse naked or half-naked wherever they finally fall. Rescuers who find bodies later, when the fire has moved on and the rubble has cooled, see human forms without clothing scattered through the ruins. From a distance in time that can look like the aftermath of a single great detonation, a blast that blew their clothes right off. In reality, it may have been minutes of screaming flight, frantic undressing and repeated exposures to shifting walls of heat. Add in the collapse factor and the story distorts even more. Big quakes don't just topple buildings in place. They pancake floors. They tip entire blocks into streets. Stairwells become vertical chutes of falling debris. People inside are tumbled, crushed, dragged across abrasive rubble. Clothing, already weakened by tears or burns, catches on jagged edges and is wrenched away. When bodies are finally pulled from voids days later, what's left on them can be little more than undergarments or a few scorched scraps. Now picture the human chaos wrapped around all this. Tens of thousands suddenly homeless, entire neighbourhoods camping in parks and open squares, wrapped in blankets, whatever they could grab, children separated from parents, people half-dressed because they ran out in the night and never went back. Relief workers, soldiers, volunteers, all improvising triage centres, food lines, refugee camps. In that swirl, memory blurs. One person saw a single gas main explosion shred the clothes off a group of people at a street corner. Another saw naked burn victims running out of a collapsing bathhouse or dormitory. A third saw rows of unclothed bodies laid out in makeshift morgues because burned garments had to be cut away for treatment or identification. Years later, those scenes merge. The earthquake, the gas blasts, the firestorm, the mass displacement, it all condenses into a simpler narrative. There was an enormous explosion. It killed thousands. It stripped them bare. So if something like our mystery event happened in an earthquake city, what traces should we expect to find? Unlike a volcano that buries the whole administrative core under rock, earthquakes and fires leave a different kind of paper trail. Fire department logs noting multiple gas main ruptures and explosions reported across the grid. Dispatch records showing engine companies disappearing when a district is overrun by flame. Municipal reports on the collapse of water mains and hydrant failures. Relief agency records are even richer. Red Cross-style organisations listing the number of displaced, the tents issued, the blankets, the bread rations. Hospital and field clinic reports tallying burn cases, crush injuries, amputations. Lists of the dead and missing compiled in the weeks and months after, full of gaps and contradictions but still there. Then you have the newspapers, early editions screaming about the great explosion, the city in flames, thousands dead, eyewitness accounts of streets turned into rivers of fire, of clothes igniting as people ran. Later, more sober coverage breaks the disaster into phases. The initial quake, the secondary gas explosions, the days-long firestorm, the slow accounting of the dead. In other words, you don't get silence, you get noise. A roar of overlapping stories that gradually solidify into an official narrative. But that's the catch. Over time, one version of events tends to win. The earthquake becomes the disaster, and the gas explosions and clothing-stripping firefronts become colourful details or urban legends or are edited out entirely. Local myths sprout in the cracks left behind, which means that if our naked, blast-killed 20,000 really came from a quake and fire city, the evidence wouldn't be a single secret document about a mysterious explosion. It would be a messy archive of routine catastrophe paperwork, sprinkled with odd, unsettling clues about what heat, rubble and gas can do to human bodies, and to the stories we tell about them. War changes how disasters are allowed to exist in public. In peacetime, an explosion in a city is a tragedy. Committees get formed, inquests are held, Newspapers demand answers. Even when governments lie or stall, the expectation is that, eventually, somebody will have to explain what happened. In wartime, an explosion is a variable. It can weaken morale, it can reveal vulnerabilities, it can hand useful data to the enemy about what you're storing, where you're storing it, and how well you can control it. It can expose incompetence that, if admitted, could topple a minister or a general. So the instinct is different. The first reflex isn't, how do we account for this? It's, how do we control this? That's why militaries have entire rule books about what must be classified the moment something goes wrong. Ammunition depots detonated by accident, experimental weapons that blow up on the pad, friendly fire incidents that turn units into ash. All of these instantly become not just technical failures, but information hazards. Think about the incentives. If word spreads that a single shell-loading mistake can wipe out a battalion, soldiers may start questioning orders. If civilians learn that the factory on the edge of town is really a bomb waiting to happen, they might not be thrilled about working there. If the enemy learns exactly how far your blast damage extended, they get a free physics lesson about your munitions, so you minimize. The official communique talks about a small accident, limited losses, a minor incident at a supply installation. Numbers are shaved. Locations are fuzzed. Timelines get vague. The language is washed until it no longer evokes charred bodies and torn-off clothing, just casualties and material damage. And behind that public face, the real record is broken up into pieces and locked away. The engineering report that explains how the chain reaction started? Classified. The casualty list with precise locations and times of death? Classified. The photographs that show what the blast did to human flesh and fabric? Definitely classified. Sometimes, years later, those documents are released, but not as they existed on day one. They come out with whole paragraphs painted over in black ink. Names missing, numbers rounded, diagrams removed for security reasons even when the war is long over. The raw horror has been filtered through decades of bureaucratic anxiety. To someone trying to reconstruct the event, that looks like emptiness. But it isn't. It's a controlled leak. Eyewitnesses live inside this pressure system too. A soldier who saw his friends literally peeled out of their uniforms by a pressure wave might be told, very clearly, that he signed a secrecy oath. A dock worker who watched a munition ship turn a harbour into a crater might be visited by officers who remind him that loose talk helps the enemy. Sometimes the pressure is subtle. Survivors are praised for their discretion. They're steered toward phrases that fit the official story. An unfortunate accident. An explosion at a warehouse. Nothing about the screams, the melted boots, the clothes hanging from trees. Sometimes it's not subtle at all. People are threatened with court-martial, with imprisonment, with losing their pensions. Foreign journalists who ask too many questions find their access revoked. Local papers get told in no uncertain terms what they can and cannot say, and propaganda steps in to do the rest. Propaganda isn't only about inventing stories, it's about framing. Take a catastrophic blast that was actually caused by negligence, poor storage, bad training, overloaded magazines. If it kills enough people, especially in wartime, there's an enormous temptation to reframe it as sacrifice. Instead of, we blew ourselves up through gross incompetence, the narrative becomes, our brave workers died supporting the war effort. The focus moves from mechanics to meaning. Blame is displaced. Graphic details go first. The fact that bodies were found nude or half nude because the blast and heat shredded their clothes? Distasteful, demoralizing, easily buried under phrases like, many perished instantly, or the remains were badly burned. Technical specifics are next. Exact tonnages, blast radii. Patterns of injury. Anything that could hint at what exactly detonated or how massive it truly was gets smoothed into generalities. What's left is a sanitized outline that can be repeated safely in speeches, schoolbooks, memorial ceremonies. A disaster is converted into an emblem, stripped of the weird, disturbing edges that make it useful to investigators, but dangerous to reputations. This is where the idea of erasure gets tricky. Events like our hypothetical 20,000 naked and dead blast rarely vanish with a single order. It's almost never. One day they're there, the next they're gone. What you get instead is a spectrum. At one end, full visibility, detailed reports, photographs, testimony, arguments in Parliament, angry editorials. At the other, near total blackout, a one-line wartime communique, a few hinted references in veterans' memoirs, maybe a vague local legend about the night the sky caught fire. Most real cases sit in between. Certain facts remain public, that there was an explosion, that people died, that the war went on. Other facts are locked behind classification or buried under euphemism. How many died exactly, how they died, why their clothes were missing, who signed off on the decisions that made the blast possible. Over decades, this partial visibility behaves like erosion. Documents are lost in floods, fires, or routine purges. People who knew the off-the-record details die. Younger generations inherit only the cleaned-up story, without the parts that made it feel like an impossible, almost mythic event. And for a researcher looking backward, it can seem like the disaster was erased from history. Not because it never happened, but because what survives is a carefully thinned shadow of what it really was. Just enough to raise questions, not enough to answer them. So when we hear about an explosion so intense it stripped 20,000 people naked and killed them, and yet we can't find a neat, well-documented entry in the history books, we shouldn't only look for a missing page. We should look for all the small cuts, edits and deflections that can turn a real catastrophe into something half-remembered, half-deniable, and easily pushed aside by a more convenient story. Which brings us to the people who actually craft those stories, the media, and how one raw, chaotic event can splinter into a dozen competing versions before settling into the truth we think we know. By the time journalists show up, the physics is over. The blast has already done what it's going to do. The pressure wave has come and gone. Buildings are either standing or not. People are either alive or not. What's left is wreckage and confusion. But that's exactly when the second explosion starts. The one made of words. Think about the first 24 hours after a major disaster. Reporters are scrambling, phones are jammed, officials are issuing half-baked statements while they're still trying to figure out what happened themselves. Witnesses are traumatized, talking over each other, misremembering times, distances, directions. Out of that noise, somebody writes the first coherent paragraph. Massive explosion in Port District. Hundreds feared dead. Survivors describe people being blown out of their clothes. Maybe that line comes from a single quote. Maybe it's the reporter's own description, watching medics carry in burn victims wrapped only in sheets. Either way, it goes into print or onto a wire service, and once it's in that pipeline, it starts to mutate. A local newspaper picks up the wire story. An editor trims for space, drops the qualifier, some survivors, and keeps the most vivid phrase, people were blown out of their clothes. A regional paper rewrites it again. The blast stripped many victims naked. A week later, a feature writer is doing a long read on the day the city died. They're not on the scene. They're working from clippings and a couple of phone interviews. The local paper's line has turned into a detail in their notes. Victims found naked in streets. They add an adjective. Thousands of victims. Thousands, not because they checked a morgue list, but because hundreds feels too small for what the photos look like. Decades pass. A historian writes a book on wartime accidents. They skimmed dozens of such disasters. Some had 10 dead, some 1,000, some no reliable figure at all. Our explosion gets a paragraph, maybe a page. The victims found naked line is still there. But now it's in the context of the blast killed an estimated 4,000. Already, numbers are drifting, but the nakedness survives every edit. Then the internet hits. A blogger doing top 10 forgotten explosions grabs that paragraph, cherry-picks the most shocking parts, rounds numbers up again, at least 10,000 dead, and writes in a style that rewards punch over precision. The explosion was so powerful it literally stripped people naked. No footnote, no archive citation, just a vague, according to some reports. Another site scrapes that blog and rewrites it for clicks. The city name is misspelled. A date is copied wrong. 1917 becomes 1971. A translator working from this mess into another language doesn't like literally, so they punch it up. An explosion that blew the clothes off 20,000 people and killed them all instantly. That line goes viral on social media, stripped of everything except the impossible image. 20,000 people, naked and dead. At each step, something gets lost and something gets amplified. Numbers creep upward because big disasters feel like they should have big body counts. Locations swap because one port city looks like another in a black and white photo. Dates drift because a World War I accident becomes World War II in one careless sentence, and no one bothers to fix it. But one detail is too good to lose. Stripped naked. It does exactly what headlines are supposed to do. It shocks. It invites morbid curiosity. It promises a level of violence that feels almost supernatural. So even when facts are blurred, was it a ship, a factory, a gas main? That phrase survives like a fossil, carried from article to article as if it were the core truth, rather than one witness's description or one reporter's metaphor. And metaphors are a huge part of how this happens. A survivor might say, "It was like the skin was ripped off the city." A journalist might write, "The blast tore the clothes off buildings." A poetically inclined editor turns a simile into a statement. The blast tore the clothes off people and buildings alike. In the original language, it's clearly figurative. A translator, decades later, doesn't see the context. They render it word for word into a language where that kind of hyperbole isn't common. Readers take it literally. Future writers quote it as fact. That's how you end up with an online claim that sounds precise. 20,000 people were stripped naked and killed. But when you start chasing the references backwards, they dissolve into newspaper clippings that say things like, "Many were found badly burned, and some bodies were unrecognizable." So how do you, as a viewer, as a reader, tell when you're dealing with this kind of story evolution instead of solid ground? There's a simple mental checklist you can run the next time you see a sensational claim like our mystery explosion. First, count the hops. Is the source you're reading the one that actually investigated the event? Or are they quoting someone who quoted a blog? According to one account, and it is said that, are red flags for third-hand information. Second, look for the paperwork. Real disasters leave boring trails. Coroner's reports, inquests, court cases, insurance documents, engineering reviews. If a massive urban catastrophe supposedly killed tens of thousands, but every article points back to the same two unsourced anecdotes, something is off. Third, watch the numbers. Do different tellings agree within a reasonable range, or are you seeing wild swings? 500 dead here, 20,000 there, 100,000 in a clickbait listicle. Big variance without explanation usually means rumour, not archive. Fourth, check the map and the calendar. Are locations, dates and wars consistent? If one version puts the blast in 1916 France and another in 1943 Japan, you might be dealing with multiple events that have been collapsed into one dramatic story. Finally, interrogate the centerpiece detail. If the naked bodies, or the glowing cloud, or the people vaporized where they stood are the only thing every version agrees on, ask why that is. Is it because every source independently confirms it? Or because it's the most gripping line and nobody wants to be the one to drop it? When we apply this checklist to the legend of the 20,000 naked and dead explosion, we start to see less of a single erased event and more of a tangle, a collage made from several real catastrophes, misremembered quotes, and decades of copying without checking. To untangle that collage, we have to turn away briefly from the headlines and look at the people who made them, the eyewitnesses, and at how memory itself behaves in the blast radius of a catastrophe. If you've ever heard someone say, "I remember exactly where I was when I heard," you've already met the first big character in this part of the story, the flashbulb memory. Psychologists coined that term after events like the Kennedy assassination and 9/11. People would say it felt like a camera went off in their mind, one brilliant frozen snapshot. The room, the smell, the exact words on the TV. Decades later, they tell the same story with total confidence. And then, when researchers compared those memories to what people had written down right after the event, something unsettling showed up. The memories had changed. Not just little stuff. Times, places, who was in the room. Sometimes people remembered watching something live that was actually broadcast hours later. They weren't lying. Their brains had simply rewritten the scene, smoothing it into a story that felt right. That's the paradox of flashbulb memories. The more vivid they are, the more trustworthy they feel, even when they aren't. Now take that effect and drop it into the middle of a physical catastrophe. A ship detonates in a harbour. A fertilizer plant goes up. A city block disappears in a white wall of air and glass. In laboratory studies, even mild stress already messes with memory. In real disasters, you're not dealing with mild stress. You're dealing with people who thought they were going to die. Under that kind of threat, your nervous system throws a switch. Vision tunnels, hearing drops anything that doesn't sound like danger. Time stretches and snaps. A 2-second blast can be remembered as a long roar, while the minutes of stumbling afterwards vanish into nothing. This is useful in the moment. You don't need an accurate documentary of the scene. You need to find a doorway, a stairwell, a child's hand. But later, when someone asks, "What happened?" your brain has to assemble a narrative from whatever shards it managed to save. That's when patterns start to appear. Across wildly different explosions, survivors report the same motifs. A roaring wind, sudden darkness, everything went black, people running around naked. Part of that is physics. A high-pressure wave really does sound like a freight train or a hurricane. Dust clouds really do turn noon into night. Heat really does burn clothing off some bodies, shred it off others, and leave you looking at crowds of injured people in underwear, in torn slips, in half-melted uniforms. But part of it is psychology. When you're in shock, your mind grabs metaphors it already understands. A roar, like a bomb. A wind, like a storm. A darkness, like someone turned out the sun. If someone else in the shelter uses a vivid phrase, it stripped them naked. Your own memory can adopt it without you realizing. The next time you tell the story, that line feels like something you saw yourself. And remember the time warp. People who were inside a building when the blast hit might remember only the moment of impact and then waking up in a hospital. Others, out on the street, might have a long, stitched-together sequence of fire, confusion, crowds. When they later swap stories, those different timescales mesh into a single sharper arc. Impact, darkness, naked crowds, sirens. That's where rumour begins. Imagine a school gym turned into a shelter. Hundreds of people on cots, bandaged faces. Somebody at the far end of the room has heard the death toll is 10,000. Someone else heard that entire streets were wiped out. Another person says their cousin saw bodies blown clean out of their clothes. None of these people has a god's eye view of the city. They each have a tiny, wounded keyhole. But over the hours and days, they listen to each other, borrow each other's images, and build a shared version of the catastrophe. Hospitals do the same thing in Fast Forward. Nurses repeat what they were told at shift change. Orderlies chat while pushing gurneys. A surgeon mutters, "They're bringing in people burned naked from the blast." A journalist overhears part of that sentence in a corridor. Burned naked becomes blown naked in their notebook. By the time it hits print, it's a solid, quotable fact. Many victims were found stripped of their clothing. Is the core idea wrong? Not necessarily. In lots of real explosions, lots of real people did end up without clothes. But the precise image, thousands, all at once, everywhere, might be something that grew in the retelling. This is where it's easy to be cruel from a distance. You can sit in an armchair surrounded by documents and say, eyewitnesses are unreliable. You can treat every human account as noise until the paperwork confirms it. That's a mistake. Without survivors, we don't know how it felt. We don't know what it was like to be on that street, in that ship's hold, under that collapsing ceiling. We don't know the screams, the smells, the moment someone realized they were suddenly, horrifyingly naked in public with their skin on fire. Eyewitnesses carry truths that never make it into engineering reports. But there's a second mistake, treating every remembered detail as if it were a calibrated instrument reading. When we talk about the explosion that stripped 20,000 people naked and killed them, we're living at the intersection of both errors. A sensational detail that probably started with someone's real, searing experience has been inflated, copied, and detached from context. Dismissing it outright erases the survivor. Swallowing it whole erases the need for evidence. The responsible middle ground is harder. You listen to the witnesses, you notice the recurring motifs, roaring wind, sudden darkness, naked crowds. You respect that those patterns point to something real, about how the disaster unfolded and how it felt. Then you set those memories next to blast physics, medical records, morgue lists, and see where they line up and where they don't. To do that, you need more than stories. You need the boring, stubborn artifacts of bureaucracy and science. You need the paper trail. The first stop is death, not in a poetic sense, in a literal administrative one. When a city is hit by a major explosion, the morgue becomes an assembly line. Bodies, body parts, unidentified remains. Each one is supposed to be logged. Time of arrival, condition, clothing, or lack of it. personal effects, cause of death if it can be determined. Coroners write those details down because they have to. Families want to know. Courts demand death certificates. Insurers won't pay without paperwork. A rumour says 20,000 dead, all blown out of their clothes. The morgue books say 3,417 processed between Tuesday and Friday. Columns marked charred, crushed, decapitated. Occasional notes like found nude, clothing burned off, no garments present. Suddenly the story starts to fracture into numbers. Maybe the city as a whole lost 10,000 people in fires and collapses over weeks. Maybe only a few hundred of those were actually in the direct blast where clothing vanished. The myth doesn't disappear, it narrows. If the morgue records have gaps, mysterious missing days, entire ledgers lost in the war, that's a clue too. Bureaucracies almost never produce perfect silence. When pages go missing, someone usually had a reason. Next, the cemeteries. You can lie in a press release. It's harder to fake the size of a mass grave. Historians walk the ground. They look for burial registers from churches and municipal authorities. They count names, dates, plot numbers. They compare official death tolls with the number of extra burials recorded in the weeks and months after the disaster. Sometimes the mismatch is small. A government says 1,500 dead. The graves suggest closer to 2,000. That's tragic, but it's within the normal fog of chaos. Sometimes the mismatch is huge. That's when people start asking why the paper trail bends. Property records tell another version of the story. Not about bodies, but about absence. In peacetime, buildings don't just vanish from the tax rolls. They burn down or get demolished, and someone files a claim. The owners, the banks, the local authorities all have incentives to document the loss. After a disaster, you see clusters, entire blocks marked destroyed by explosion, total loss, condemned. If you can't find those records, but you know a neighbourhood existed before and is a rubble after, that silence is informative. Either the state never allowed the losses to be properly registered, or the archives that held those files have been curated. Then there are the hospitals. At the time of the blast, clerks are triaging on paper as frantically as doctors are triaging on gurneys. Admissions books, surgical logs, daily bed counts. Later, these same records get used to justify budgets, request more staff, order more bandages. So even in overrun facilities, some numbers get written down. This is where the naked crowds rumour can be tested. If hundreds or thousands of patients arrived without clothes, the nurses would note it because they had to issue gowns, blankets, replacement garments. Even a line like "most patients arrived with clothes burned away" tells you a lot about the thermal profile of the blast. If hospital logs instead say lacerations from flying glass, fractures from collapsing roofs, burns from subsequent fires, but almost nothing about clothing, that suggests an explosion that shattered windows and started blazes, but maybe didn't generate the kind of flash that strips garments wholesale. Now zoom out from the human paperwork to the machine paperwork. Disasters leave fingerprints in physics, not just in memories. Weather data. Was it a cold, dry day when static charges could build? Hot and humid, with temperature inversions that trap blast waves and smoke? Wind speed and direction decide which side of a harbour gets obliterated and which side mostly hears the boom. Seismic readings. Big explosions ring the ground like a bell. Even in the early 20th century, many countries had basic seismographs humming away in observatories, logging distant earthquakes, and occasionally massive blasts. If a supposed city-killing detonation never shows up in any regional seismic records, that raises questions. If it does, you can estimate its size. Blast radius modelling. Engineers take survivor accounts, windows blown out at 5 kilometres, roofs peeled off at 3, and run them against known yield curves from other explosions. You can estimate how many people would have been close enough to be declothed by pressure and heat alone. Sometimes the models line up beautifully with the stories. Sometimes they say, for 20,000 naked bodies you'd need a blast this big, at this location, with this many structures close by, and the known layout of the city simply doesn't match. There's another layer of documentation that local governments don't fully control. The outsiders. Diplomats file dispatches. Their job is to tell their own capitals privately what really happened. If a port blows up, the consuls of half a dozen countries will cable home with casualty estimates, descriptions of damage, and any rumours of sabotage or cover-ups. International insurers keep meticulous records because money is on the line. Marine insurance syndicates in London, New York, Hamburg These institutions have no sentimental reason to inflate or deflate casualty numbers. They care about the tonnage lost, the warehouses flattened, the claims they'll have to pay. Their files can reveal the true scale of destruction even when local newspapers are muzzled. Foreign journalists, missionaries, relief workers, even telegraph companies leave traces too. A cable that says lines cut by explosion, city in ruins, is hard to delete everywhere it travelled. So with all these independent witnesses, morgue clerks, grave diggers, bank managers, nurses, seismographs, weather stations, foreign insurers, you might think it's impossible for a disaster big enough to strip and kill 20,000 people to simply vanish. And yet, when historians go looking, they often run into locked doors. Some archives are classified in the name of national security. Wartime explosions that exposed military secrets can stay behind red tape for 50, 70, even 100 years. Occasionally the files exist on paper, but are inexplicably missing in the boxes. Other archives are closed for more mundane reasons: privacy laws, bureaucratic inertia, underfunded staff who haven't even catalogued the relevant years. In some countries, records were destroyed by later wars, earthquakes, or deliberate purges. That's how you end up with this strange situation. A rumour that sounds impossible, eyewitness accounts that sound vivid, physical traces that are scattered, and boxes of documents that someone, somewhere, has decided you're not allowed to see. To move forward, you have to accept two things at once. First, the paper trail is powerful. It can puncture myths, reveal hidden carnage, and tell you whether a naked, burning crowd was a few hundred people on a single street or something far worse. Second, the paper trail is human. It's written by people with incentives, fears, and bosses. It can be censored, shredded, or quietly left to rot. Which brings us to the next question. If an explosion really did strip and kill thousands, why would anyone work so hard to blur it out of history? When people hit that wall in the archives, they often jump straight to one explanation: conspiracy. Some general, some dictator, some evil corporation must have ordered the truth buried. Sometimes that's exactly what happened. But more often, catastrophe gets erased for reasons that are messier, more banal, and in their own way, more disturbing. Start with competition. Your disaster doesn't exist in a vacuum. It lands in a timeline already crowded with other horrors. If an ammunition ship explodes in a harbour in 1943, but 2 months later the same country is hit by a massive air raid that kills 10 times as many, which one do people build their national story around? Which one gets the annual moment of silence, the school assemblies, the newsreel footage recycled every anniversary? Big wars swallow smaller tragedies. A port explosion that strips a few thousand dock workers naked and kills them is unspeakably awful. But compared to a whole city firebombed into ash, it becomes one of many regrettable wartime incidents. It slides down the priority list. It stops being a symbol. Then there's political turnover. A government that presided over a catastrophic screw-up, bad safety protocols, negligent storage, ignored warnings, might fall a year later. The next regime has zero interest in commemorating the previous lot's shame, so the new leaders emphasize different events: victories, heroic battles, liberation days. They rename streets, melt down plaques, quietly let certain files go missing. In official speeches, the explosion becomes the unfortunate incident, folded into a bland paragraph about the trials our nation endured. The specificity is stripped away, just like the clothes were. What remains is an abstract blur. Stigma does its own silencing. If most of the victims were poor, or prisoners, or colonial subjects, or members of a persecuted minority, their deaths may not fit the narrative the powerful want to tell. An explosion that wipes out a white officers' club in a colonial port is a national tragedy. One that devastates the adjoining native quarter, killing thousands of unregistered labourers, is unfortunate civil disturbances, or property losses. Historians notice a pattern. The higher your social class, the better your odds of being named, mourned, statistically counted. The lower you are, the more anonymous your death becomes. Class bias, racial bias, colonial bias, they all shape what gets written down, what gets carved into stone, and what quietly dissolves. Now imagine the physical world of the explosion itself. The blast doesn't just kill people, it shreds the very infrastructure that would have remembered them. The church that kept the parish register, gone. the municipal building where death certificates were filed, a smoking crater. The print shop that ran the local newspaper, flattened. The neighbourhood that would have held annual memorial marches told stories to the kids, pointed and said, "That's where it happened," evacuated, rebuilt into something else, or bulldozed later to make way for a freeway, a shopping centre, a new port. When people scatter, fleeing fires, hunger, the collapse of a local industry, community memory fractures. The old men on the corner who could say, "I was there," they're no longer on the same corner or even in the same country. Their stories become isolated monologues, not a shared tradition. Give it one generation, maybe two, and a very strange thing happens. The event is still known, but only as rumour. Didn't your grandmother say something about an explosion? Yeah, clothes burned off, bodies everywhere, but no one ever talked about it. Which brings us to narrative control. After a catastrophe, somebody has to explain it. Governments, companies, military commands, they all rush to construct the official story. If the real chain of events involves negligence, corruption, illegal cargoes, banned weapons, or a doomed attempt to hide something already illegal, then the official story will be engineered to redirect attention. Maybe the explosion gets framed as an act of enemy sabotage. Maybe it's chalked up to unavoidable lightning or freak accident. Maybe the casualty numbers are flattened, dozens killed, even when internal memos say estimated 5,000. Over time, those first public statements harden into reference points. Later journalists and textbook writers quote them. The minimized version becomes the default reality everyone starts from, and the absence of commemoration does the rest. Think about the disasters you actually know by name, the ones you learned in school. They have monuments, physical objects you can visit, sculptures, plaques, museums. They have anniversaries, dates that get circled on calendars, that generate think pieces and TV specials. They have standardized language, the Great Fire of, the explosion of, the massacre at. Erasure works in reverse. No monument, no dedicated grave, no day off work, no chapter in the national curriculum, maybe a small plaque on a back wall somewhere, or a local leaflet printed once and never reissued. Children grow up walking over the ground where thousands died and never hear why that area is oddly open, why the buildings are newer, why the older people in town go quiet when certain sirens are tested. That silence is not proof nothing happened. It's proof that the event lost all its anchors. Without a place to go, a day to remember, a story that ties it into the larger who we are. The naked, burning crowd flickers once in collective memory, and then is pushed aside by bigger wars, cleaner narratives, more convenient heroes. So when we say a catastrophe was erased from history, we're usually not talking about a single villain shredding a single file. We're talking about a slow, multi-layered process where social bias decides whose deaths count. Destruction wipes out the local memory keepers, migration scatters the witnesses, and official narratives quietly steer attention somewhere else. By the time you and I come along, what's left is a handful of contradictory testimonies, a rumour about 20,000 naked bodies, and a very uncomfortable question. If that many people really died like that, where are their monuments? And if there are none, what exactly are we missing? To answer that, we have to do something. History is very bad at rebuild what was never meant to be remembered. So let's put everything on the table. Our defining clues are weirdly specific. First, the scale. We're not talking about a few dozen casualties. The story insists on something like 20,000 people, dead or horribly injured in one event. Second, the clothing. Not just burned bodies, but a crowd of people whose clothes were blasted or incinerated off, naked or almost. Third, the erasure. No universally known name, no schoolbook headline, just scattered references and half-remembered fragments. Now weigh that against the candidates. A single munitions ship or depot can definitely strip clothing and kill in the thousands. Halifax, Texas City, Beirut. Every major blast like that produces reports of people found naked, clothes shredded or burned away while the body survives just long enough to be counted. But actual well-documented events top out in the low thousands killed, not 20,000. To reach that number, you need either a much bigger blast than anything we've confirmed in a port, or you need more than one incident. Industrial chemical disasters, same story. Bhopal didn't strip clothing, but it killed quietly in the night by the thousands. Uppau and other nitrate explosions did blast clothes off people, create mass casualties, and flatten entire districts. But again, not 20,000 dead in one go, not in any surviving official figure. Volcanic blasts and pyroclastic surges absolutely can do it. They can kill tens of thousands, incinerate clothing, and leave bodies laid out as if asleep. Pompeii, St. Pierre, Mount Lamington, Mount Pelée. Here, the scale and the nakedness line up beautifully. But those events are not erased. They have names, monuments, ash-preserved corpses in museums. Even where colonial biases minimized local deaths, volcanology eventually circled back and wrote them in. Earthquakes, gas mains, city fires. Plenty of burned or crushed victims, plenty of clothes torn away during rescue or decomposition, but the stripped naked in an instant detail fits less cleanly. Firestorms scorch. They don't usually peel a city's worth of clothing off in one synchronized moment. If you're strict about the evidence, none of these categories, by itself, in a single, unknown event, ticks every box. So what's more likely? That there was one gargantuan, perfectly censored catastrophe that somehow left no clear archival footprint, or that multiple real disasters over a few decades got folded into a single simplified legend. Imagine a port city in a colonial empire. First, a wartime ammunition ship explodes, hundreds dead, clothes blasted off, chaos. A decade later, a fertilizer plant on the same shoreline detonates, same neighborhoods hit, same images burned into survivors' minds. Add an urban fire during an air raid, maybe a smaller gas main explosion in between. Each episode kills hundreds or thousands, many of them poor, migrant, or otherwise invisible to official statistics. Each one gets undercounted, misattributed, euphemized. In the local oral tradition, they blur. To a grandchild hearing late-night stories from 3 different elders, it's not the explosion in 42, then the one in 53. It's just the time the whole city blew up, and people's clothes vanished, and thousands died. Historians see this kind of fusion all the time. Battles that were actually a campaign spread over months become the Great Battle. A series of famines collapses into the Great Hunger. Memory likes single peaks, not messy plateaus. So the most plausible explanation looks less like a missing super event and more like a missing pattern. A cluster of large but not unprecedented blasts, ships, depots, chemical plants, hitting dense, poorly recorded populations, each capable of stripping clothes from bodies within a certain radius, each partially documented, partially minimized. Later, condensed by rumor into one unforgettable image, 20,000 naked dead. Could there have been one dominant anchor disaster in that cluster? A single explosion that really did kill far more than the official number, especially among unregistered workers or colonized subjects? Absolutely. That's consistent with what we know about undercounting in port and industrial catastrophes. To move from plausible story to solid history, we'd need specific things. Port and insurance records showing unexplained write-offs far larger than the known casualty numbers. Hospital logs overwhelmed on a single date. Private diaries or letters mentioning naked, burned crowds in a city that has no famous explosion in its official timeline. A cluster of foreign consular reports all hinting at something much worse than the local press admitted. If those independent sources point to the same place, the same day, the same rough death toll, the legend snaps into focus. Not myth, but a distorted echo of something real. Until that happens, we have to live with uncertainty. The best we can say is this: explosions big enough to strip thousands of people naked absolutely have happened. They've killed in the thousands. They've been forgotten, minimized, or folded into larger narratives. Whether the 20,000 naked catastrophe was one monstrous blast or the fusion of several, the image survives because it captures something true about industrial war and empire. How violently they can destroy bodies, and how easily they can lose count. History, here, is not a closed case. It's an open file with missing pages. All we've done is narrow the search, from impossible story to highly likely family of events. What comes next depends on whether anyone is willing to go back into the archives, compare the rumours with the ledgers, and ask yet again, who died, where, and why didn't we bother to remember them? So where does that leave us? Not with a neat answer, not with a secret super explosion we can point to on a calendar and engrave on a plaque. What we really uncovered is a pattern and a blind spot. We've seen that blasts powerful enough to rip clothes from bodies are not fantasy, Naval munitions, nitrate warehouses, fuel depots, volcanic surges, they all can and have done that. We've seen how casualty numbers for the poor, the colonized, the undocumented are routinely shaved down, rounded off, or simply never counted. We've seen how memory compresses a series of horrors into one story that's easier to tell. So the legend of 20,000 naked dead is probably not pure invention. It's a distorted window into something very real. The scale of violence industrial society can unleash, and the ease with which that violence can be buried under paperwork and silence. That's what's worth remembering. Not just the spectacular physics of a blast, but the ordinary people standing in its path. Dockworkers, clerks, children on their way to school, people whose last moment was so violent their own clothes vanished, and whose names may never have been written down. If you want more deep dives into the parts of the past we almost lost, prehistoric bottlenecks, forgotten species, the long, strange road that led to us, I've written a whole book about those buried secrets. You can read more about it and pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. And if you have leads, local stories about a great explosion, family letters, city legends that sound eerily similar, share them. Post them in the comments. Sometimes the trail to an erased catastrophe starts with one person saying, "My grandmother used to tell a story." While you're there, let me know where you're listening from, which city, which coast, which fault line. Like, comment and subscribe if you want more careful, slightly obsessive excavations of the past, because this isn't just my mystery, it's ours. And the only way we stop losing people twice, first to disaster, then to forgetting, is by doing the slow, stubborn work of looking back and refusing to look away.